Hello, hello.
Hello, everyone. Hello. Ciao. Okay, so we have a few students. I was expecting two of my students, honestly, but it's okay. So, shall we get started with another couple of minutes?
Yeah, there must be a few more students. We'll give them the benefit of the,
Hi. Okay, plenty of seats. So,
very good.
hey, wow, the feeling that you want to look like that's amazing. Okay. You guys mind if I take a picture and send it to our colleagues to brag about?
Please, take a picture. I'll also need it for the social media.
Okay, I'll take one or two. Problem is that either you or the audience funny to find.
No problem, yeah, so, we can both do that, yeah, that's perfect.
Oh, okay. Okay, guys, we're done. You can go. Uh, okay. So again, I see a couple of my students might still be late, but I guess we can get started. So let's capture Landon is here, and let's get someone comes a little later. That's our students. Huh? It's not true. It's outside. Okay, whatever. Okay, what about that? So, guys, again, this is part of, let me very briefly introduce myself. My name is Diego Pagliarolo and I teach world politics here at John Cabot. Okay, so this is a guest lecture that Professor Ibrahim Al-Marashi is very kindly given my seat. So the idea started as a way to give my world politics students a perspective on the Middle East. But then it grew thanks largely to the fact that Professor Al-Marashi is very, very good and very, very popular. This became one of the presents that we have today. So you probably know Professor Samuel. Most of you, how many of you are taking courses with Professor Al-Marashi this semester? Okay, lucky you guys. Lucky you.
Oh, thank you.
Professor Al-Marashi really is an expert in in anything, honestly, anything you ask him, and he has something interesting to say. But in particular, when it comes to the Middle East, he is Really, it's very hard to find someone that is more insightful and knowledgeable than Professor Al-Marashi. Okay, so as you know, today's lecture is entitled "The Middle East and the International System After the Iran War." So I would say that I don't say anything else, and I'm going to leave Professor Al-Marashi the floor. So thank you very much, all of you. Thanks very much for coming.
Well, thank you. And I hope during the discussion you'll say a lot more. I also want to introduce Professor Andrea Dezzi, who teaches Middle East politics up at American University of Rome as well. So we have a room full of Middle East experts. I will also be talking about media in the Middle East for my media course. And we have Professor Saram, who is an expert on media in the region as well. So without
Also Professor James.
Yes.
Your last name. James Kohler. The Kohler, James Kohler, was he is an archaeologist, and what I find, the thing is that we often bump into each other in the faculty room, and he prefers classes, and we look at the same maps. Basically, we have the same maps of the Middle East, yet he studies great civilizations, and we are studying how civilization is progressing.
Well, civilization is a great key word to open up this debate, because I'm also going to deal a little bit with the preservation or cultural heritage for that matter. And of course, the last time we bumped into each other was in Berlin. Do you remember the ancient Egyptian section in Berlin, on Museum Island? That's talk about civilizations. But without further ado, usually you have me in a big class, I do this to get us started. So without further ado, so basically, let me tell you a little bit of what I call the me search behind the research. What is my connection with Iran? Professor Salam probably doesn't even know this, because Antonio, yes, you've always known me as an Iraqi. But when I write about the following article, Iran and the US have been in it for decades. Just to show you my connection to the subject. Well, it begins with the 1400s, before Uzbek prince, you could call him that, Timur, began his campaigns in the Middle East. You'll see a little princely state here known as the Al-Marashi dynasty, and that's where my family originates from. At this time, the Ottomans were confined to Anatolia, and of course, we lost our princely dynasty because they couldn't stand up to the Timurids or Tamerlane. And from that point onwards, when I talk about cultural heritage and preservation, in fact, the founder of the Marashi dynasty, this is a shrine on the Caspian Sea. So you could call him the original Prince Caspian for Narnia. And this was always, of course, with all the cultural heritage that got destroyed, the Gulistan Palace and other sites which I've written about, this was something more personal. When this site survived the bombing campaign. So yeah, this is where my great ancestor would have been buried, in the north of Iran, in Amul on the Caspian Sea. And sure enough, you can see in the following from that dynasty, here is my illustrious ancestor, the strangulation of the Marashi Safavid queen, Queen Nisa Begum. So this is, okay, she got strangled, but still I'm flexing. Like, okay, but at least she intermarried into the family. So of course, from these, and she was, of course, strangled by the Kizilbash, the Turkic warrior elite, that more or less established. And again, when I talk about a civilization, of course, the word Kizilbash itself is a Turkish word, meaning the red heads. And for all intents and purposes, this group of people would be the ancestors of the Azerbaijanis today. And you have to realize what we know as Iran, the kind of borders, it only came to being in the 1500s out of a Turkic confederation, tribal confederation. Okay. From here, it's quite an interesting story. The Kizilbash began in this area here, but the founder of, we could say, the empire of Iran post 1500 that not only made Iran conform to its borders, but also 12 or Shia. It was founded by a Turkic dynasty. The Kizilbash, for all intents and purposes, were Turkic, intermarrying with Pontic Greeks from Trabzon. We could say the founder of the Iranian Empire in the 1500s was due to a Greco-Turkish marriage. Nevertheless, from there, I go to this article because, yes, for most of my academic career, I had been writing about what's happening in Iraq. I'll never forget in the summer of 2014 when I was standing in this very classroom and I heard that 1/3 of Iraq's territory had fallen to ISIS. 2014, it was the first time I was teaching media in the Arab world at the invitation of Professor Antonio Lopez. And if you look at the article I had written for the Huffington Post, again, this is another flex. I'm more proud of this than my Iranian queen ancestor. I got more hits than Noam Chomsky that day. For a lot of you, okay, I just realized.
That before or after the answer?
I was about to say, yeah, I should maybe delete this slide. Anyway, and the Epstein files will come up in this some manner later in this class. Of course, in 2014, so ISIS had, marched through Iraq just before July 1st. What I was writing about was, of course, one of the first peoples to resist the British invasion of what we call Iraq, or the British invasion of the Ottoman Empire, would have been my grandfather. My grandfather had picked up a rifle and joined the 1920 Iraqi revolt against the British and their attempts to install a pliant king from the Hejaz, Saudi Arabia, one of the families that was working with Lawrence of Arabia during the Arab Revolt. And my grandfather basically took part in that event that one argues, some academics argue, made the Iraqi nation in opposition to British rule. Now, the interesting thing about this, of course, this is for those of you in my history class. Hey, come on in. For those of you in my history class, I think is for those of you who are doing Mamluks and Ottomans in my history class, right? What would we say about this? This is a secondary source, okay? But the primary source that I found was quite interesting, was my grandfather's passport. And this was quite a surprise when I found this, that I did not realize that if you look at this emblem here, this is the emblem that I would say the flag that's been weaponized and securitized most recently as a symbol of regime change in Iran very recently. But of course, I find this, it's not only just a great document, that what was known as Iran was the Dawlat, Devlet, or Adolat, Shahin-Shahi Iran. It doesn't translate very well into the Empire of Persia. And this is before the name had officially been changed to Iran. But if you can see here, of course, yes, my grandfather would have been born in Najaf. Najaf is not in Iran, but it's the equivalent for what is Shia Muslims' Vatican City. Okay. And of course, why was my grandfather in Najaf? He was training to be a cleric, hence the black turban on his head. And again, just as a primary source, I love for my history students to just appreciate that in Persian, when you translate skin complexions, okay, these terms we use to this very day, white and black, to describe various skin complexions, that doesn't translate very well in Middle Eastern languages, right? Basically, to describe my grandfather's skin complexion, he would have been called wheatish, for example. When I ask you, how do we translate a word like samra? For those of you who don't know the singer Saint Laurent, who has a very famous song called Samra, roughly translated as olive complexion, but again, it's a poor translation. Okay. But yes, my grandfather was trained to be a cleric. He had the color of Wheaties, not Wheaties, that's a cereal. His color was wheatish. He was born in Najaf. And then because he fought against the British, he had to escape the empire that was trying to arrest him for revolting against British imperial rule in Iraq. Interestingly enough, where did he end up? Well, he ended up in this island here called Zanzibar. And sure enough, what followed him to Zanzibar? The British Empire as well. The British Empire was after him. He got to Zanzibar. By the time he arrived, Zanzibar had also fallen to the British Empire. My grandfather is not like one of those rebels in Star Wars. He gave up the fight against the Empire. And so sure enough, my father would have been born in Zanzibar. Zanzibar is, of course, why did he go there? Well, I'll tell you, what does a cleric of Iranian origin who studied in Najaf, why does he end up in East Africa? Well, I'll tell you this story, but the interesting thing about Zanzibar, it was once the capital of Oman. You have to imagine this state that controls the Straits of Hormuz on the other side was once administered from this East African island. And before the Omanis came, there was a huge population that came from the Iranian city of Shiraz to settle in Zanzibar. So that the largest party in Zanzibar is called the Afro-Shirazi Party. Did you know this? Yeah. The Afro-Shirazi Party of Zanzibar is Zanzibar's largest party. Zanzibar, by the way, you all know the language of Zanzibar, Swahili. You all know a bit of Swahili. You all do. If I ask you habari, how are you in Swahili? Habari in Arabic, habari. You say, hey, hakuna matata. Does this ring a bell? This comes from, of course, the Lion King. I have no words. You all know the Swahili word for a lion. Simba. And probably on Saturday, all of you are going to take this and get out of Rome and escape the heat. When you take any trip in Swahili, we call it a safari. You pronounce it a safari. Yeah, it's just any trip. And so I don't have any pictures or primary sources of my father. But I do have a picture of my father's neighbor. My father's neighbor here, who would have come from what is today Bombay, Gujarat. And this is it. Why did my grandfather go to Zanzibar? The British Empire imported a huge labor force from Gujarat and Bombay. Of course, one of the most famous person who came from this area that was imported into not East Africa, but South Africa, you know him as Gandhi, was part of this population exchange. And Gujarat, Bombay has a large population of, hello, Victoria. Gujarat and Bombay has a large population of Parsis. Okay, Parsis practice Zoroastrianism. The religion that was practiced in Iran, eventually a good number of Zoroastrians fled to India. And the religion practiced in India is known, the community is known as the Parsi community, and a large number of Shia Muslims in India. So that Zanzibar would eventually have a large Shia community. And this is who my grandfather was the imam for. This is who he preached to. Yeah, and this is, of course, my dad's neighbor going back to Gujarat/Bombay to visit his ancestral lands. But of course, this is, his name, Farrokh Bolsara, was my dad's neighbor, lived 10 minutes away from my dad. Farrokh Bolsara, Farrokh is a very Persian name. It's one of the most ancient Zoroastrian Persian names. This is where he was born. And of course, all know Farrokh Bolsara. He later changed his name to Freddie and added the last name Mercury instead of Bolsara. Freddie Mercury was my dad's neighbor. Coming from the Zoroastrian community of Gujarat/Bombay, moved to Zanzibar with the population exchanges, was my dad's neighbor. And of course, what happens, because Zanzibar was part of the British Empire, when Zanzibar unites with Tanzania, and if anyone who wasn't considered, purely African had to leave the island, both Freddie's family, or Farrokh's family, my father, ended up in the United Kingdom. You go back to the imperial metropole. And of course, so Freddie, went back to London. Went to London, established queen, another queen, not my ancestor. And what did my father do? Well, he played bass for Queen. No, I'm joking. He went to medical school. He's still a Persian at the end of the day. Yes, he ended up going to medical school and becoming a doctor in London. But why do I tell you this story? Because when we were talking about civilizations, it was a perfect segue. When Trump says, I'm going to destroy an entire civilization in the span of a single night, destroy this. Destroy this. This is the civilization he's threatening to destroy. And do you understand that this is not a civilization just confined to Iran itself? It's a civilization that spans continents. It's a civilization that spans time. And it's a civilization that carries my DNA. That's not something Trump could destroy in a single night. By the way, go listen. This is your homework for all my students tonight. Go listen to Bohemian Rhapsody tonight. And ask yourself this, why is he saying Bismillah in the middle of the song? In the name of God. Well, he would have heard that from my grandfather 5 times a day when he would make the call to prayer. Being at the closest mosque to his house, I like to say that, I don't know, and of course, you know, I can't interview him, but I like to think the first time he heard Bismillah would have come from my grandfather. And this is the civilization that Trump threatened to destroy overnight. And civilizations are a good way to begin this lecture because you have to remember, in the class of world politics, you see, right? The idea that conflict after the Cold War would occur along civilizational lines gained quite a bit of currency. So for all of you who haven't heard of this, the Clash of Civilizations was an idea proffered by a Harvard political scientist named Samuel Huntington. And his argument was after the end of the Cold War, the battle between the First World, Second World over the Third World would be replaced by a series of civilizational conflicts. And basically, he defined a Western civilization in conflict with an Islamic civilization, that is from Morocco to Indonesia. A Western civilization in conflict with an Orthodox civilization centered around Russia, in conflict with a Sinic civilization, S-I-N-C, in other words, China. And while the theory was didn't gain much currency in the 1990s when he wrote his original Foreign Affairs article that later became a book. The Foreign Affairs article was called The Clash of Civilizations with a question mark. The book in 1996, if I'm not mistaken, was The Clash of Civilizations, no question. And really after 9/11, his idea took off. It became absorbed. You had Italian politicians referring to clash of civilizations, Berlusconi referring to civilizational clashes, all the way to a aspiring president after the Paris attacks in 2015 conducted by ISIS said, we are living a clash of civilizations. That aspiring presidential candidate, his name was Marco Rubio. Not running for president. He lost against Trump. But he is who today? Well, Secretary of State. The Secretary of State at the helm of the diplomacy, the so-called diplomacy with Iran. Basically, not only believed in the clash of civilizations, so does his Secretary of Defense, Trump's Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, also speaks on conflicts in civilizational terms. Interestingly enough, for my history class, the term wasn't invented by Huntington. It was invented by a historian named Bernard Lewis at Princeton, who wrote that article, or wrote about that term, and wrote that term in response to the 1990-91 Gulf crisis, which he argued was the beginning of a clash of civilizations between the West and the Islamic world, forgetting that a good number of Islamic nations, Arab Islamic nations, were allies with the US, including Saudi Arabia, the most Muslim of all countries. Nevertheless, this is the civilizational aspect we find ourselves in. Okay. The clash of civilizations after 9/11 very much was a term that, if you hated it or liked it, you have to admit the term had become a currency in world affairs. President Obama, when he was speaking in the White House after the rise of ISIS, on 3 separate occasions denounces the term, says the fight with ISIS is not a clash of civilizations, and whether you're supporting it or denouncing it, nevertheless, this is the parameters of debating world politics after the war. And now this is the question: what's next? What after the clash of civilizations? Okay, so let's go back to this incident. So to begin, let's go back to my research on Iraq. Okay. This is Colin Powell. Again, just a far cry. I mean, secretaries of state in 2003 compared to Marco Rubio. But let's look what happened in 2003 to begin this lecture. So since the year 2000, what was the subject I've been working on, and what lessons can we take from my research in the year 2000 up to 2003 and bring that to the present? So let us begin. This video, Channel 4 News, it's February 2003. And let's see what the evening news, what story did it break in February 2003, about February 8th. Okay, so here we are now, a couple of British prime ministers later. So why do I show this particular video? It's a reminder. So a reminder on a couple of levels for the historians in my history class. Aspiring historians, just like Bernard Lewis's term, a historian was appropriated by political scientists and gained a lot of currency. For the ones in my history class, again, do you see the value of history to current policy? Unethical. In that, in this case, instead of quoting me like Bernard Lewis was, I was just simply, my research was taken out of context, and the year 1991 was deleted and replaced with 2003. Do you see the value of history here? Okay. For my media students, do you see how the British media on the eve of the 2003 Iraq War did what the media was supposed to do in its role as the fourth estate, the watchdog function, okay? Exposing an obvious fabrication from the British government, okay? Tony Blair's office, and for those of you who know British politics, the fabrication was conducted by one Alistair Campbell, whose name came up when the British ambassador spoke very recently. Alistair Campbell, I want you to think, if you don't know him, he has an official title under Tony Blair's in the Prime Minister's office. But just think about this. After Princess Diana died, remember when the Queen was in mourning and didn't address the British public? It was Tony Blair who addressed the British public and referred to Princess Diana, we're mourning the people's princess. And I want you to think, who came up with that? Was it Tony Blair? No, it's Alistair Campbell. And in this particular case, again, this Iraq dossier was basically the product of Alistair Campbell's office within the Prime Minister's office in number 10. But why do I show this video? Again, in reference for those of you who attended the British ambassador's lecture, what did he call the events of February 28th? The third Gulf War, or the third, he called it that, the third Gulf War. If we use that terminology, let's think at what has changed, and this is for the world politics students. And just a review. The first Gulf War began when President George H. Bush approached the United Nations to get a UN Security Council resolution, not only condemning Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, but a resolution authorizing the use of any means necessary to compel the Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait. Okay. A couple of resolutions later. And for those of you who don't know, the argument of my doctoral thesis with this is when Bush went to the UN and got that Security Council resolution, Saddam invaded on August 2nd. The UN Security Council resolution passed on August 8th. And how did we know the Cold War was ending? Neither the Soviet Union nor China vetoed that, you see. And that more or less tied Saddam Hussein's hand. The minute the resolution was passed and military force was justified and US forces were heading to Saudi Arabia, then and only then Saddam annexed Kuwait and declared it his 19th province, okay? For the American action, he had to do something to show his force and resolution. And remember, the 91 Gulf War was done in the name of a UN Security Council resolution. It was they who set the deadline for Saddam Hussein to withdraw by January 15th. And when he refused, then the bombs started falling on January 16th. There was no surprise to him. The war was declared. Everyone was expecting it. And to everyone's surprise, again, what lessons can we draw from that? So remember, this was a war that was basically America showing in the post-Cold War order, we are still going to work through the international organization in the name of a new world order. Even though we're entering an age of American unipolarity, we still go through the UN to discipline the violators of the New World Order, and we're still going to use military force only in a coalition, a multilateral coalition. A coalition that, no matter how large it was, still didn't overthrow Saddam Hussein. And for that reason, Saddam Hussein declared, I won the 91 Gulf War. Now, does this sound familiar? I won the 91 Gulf War by simply surviving. In fact, and look at this, 19 Iraqi provinces. Okay, one is Kuwait, that would obviously get lost. But out of the remaining 18, 15 of those provinces did revolt against Saddam Hussein because George H. Bush told the Iraqi people, now it's your job to get rid of Saddam. Not only did he withstand a coalition of 30 nations, it was actually 40 nations. Not only did he withstand that war more or less lasted around the same time the third Gulf War lasted. He crushed an internal uprising. And not only that, to George H. Bush's embarrassment, George H. Bush didn't even win a second term. When everyone thought after winning a war, he's surely going to win a second. And Saddam declared this, it's my victory. Yeah, I survived. That's enough to declare victory. I crushed an internal uprising, and I lasted longer than even my nemesis, George H. Bush. Now let's jump to the second Gulf War of 2003. Okay. Now you're seeing what is similar. What is George W. Bush going through? He's going through the motions of appealing to an international organization. Remember, Colin Powell is addressing the UN General Assembly. What is he calling for? A follow-up to a UN Security Council resolution that would give Bush the cover to use military force again in 2003. This time around, the UN did not oblige the American request. But nevertheless, the war happened. And in alliance with the UK and a few other countries, which were called the Coalition of the Willing, which included countries like Palau, if I'm not mistaken, a bunch of Georgia, a bunch of small countries became part of that coalition. The war lasted around the same time. Saddam, in this case, did not survive. But at least he went through the motions of approaching the UN. In 2026, look how far now the third Gulf War has come. The war was expected, but still took everyone by surprise. It's not an alliance with the UK. It's in fact an alliance with Israel. It's a surprise attack. And this time the assassination succeeded. We tend to forget. Everyone said, how can Trump and Israel conduct an assassination of a foreign head of state? Let's not forget, that was the first day of the second Gulf War, 2003, an attempted assassination of Saddam. The war began because they thought he was in a farm. It turned out he was not there. A bunch of civilians were killed. But that it was attempted before, just to show you the continuity.
That happened also during the first Gulf War.
They Saddam was there. So yeah, this is not a historical. No, thank you. You reminded me. They used to bomb a bunker or a busting bomb. You're right. So this is for the world politics students now. It's the third Gulf War now is coming to an end. And this was my assessment. Why did Iran's leaders not back down? As it seemed like conflict was imminent. And in this article I wrote, let's learn the lessons of Saddam Hussein. It's better on February 27th to not give in and take the bombing of the US and Israel than to seem like you surrendered to outside pressure. Saddam didn't give in to this, and neither did Ayatollah Khamenei, even though in this case it cost him his life. Okay. But what can his son claim? Ayatollah Khamenei lost his life. And to everyone's surprise, who did power pass down to? His son. Now, why is this a surprise? Because this is this not an Islamic republic that doesn't do hereditary successions? Wasn't it the son of the Shah who wanted to come back to power, claiming descent from his father who was overthrown in 1979? But you're looking at it through the different lens. You see, Khamenei did not surrender and died a martyr's death. And if you understand anything about Shia Islam, dying a martyr's death, who died in martyr's death and handed the mantle to his son? Imam Ali, handling the mantle to his son, Imam Hussein. So from a Shia perspective, this is what Ayatollah Khamenei was able to gain in death. Anyway, okay, that's the picture of these last Gulf Wars. Now let's get another historical analogy that's been invoked quite common. And I love this map. And I'm going to be looking at a couple of maps because basically my argument is maps kind of precondition the way we see the region and outcomes. And I want you to look at this narrow waterway here. That's the Suez Canal. Let's forget this narrow waterway here. This is the Bab el-Mandeb, or this Door of Tears. And then the other narrow waterway that's got so much attention, the Straits of Hormuz. And now you also understand, if you look at just simply the elevated terrain in this relief map, it was always said, why couldn't the US launch a ground invasion and take the other side of the Straits of Hormuz? Well, you're seeing it. These are like D-Day-like mountains, if you will, Normandy Beach-type mountains. And on the other side, you see from the Omani side, this too is a mountain range, which is quite fascinating. The people who live here is controlled by Oman. It's not continuous with Oman. The Musandam Peninsula is inhabited by a group of people who speak a mix of Arabic, of course, and Persian, and Portuguese. And why the Portuguese? Because let's not forget the Portuguese at one time controlled this narrow waterway here, as well as this narrow waterway. And now if I tell you a story of, these three choke points, let's not forget what happened in 1956. And this is the other historical precedent that's been invoked quite often. In 1956, what happened? Again, of course, a historian never says history repeats, but there are some elements that are quite striking. In this case, Israel's ally for regime change was the British and French. And then it was the attempt to overthrow the leader of Egypt, Jamal Abdel Nasser. Militarily, the British wanted to regain control over the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal had just been nationalized by Nasser. The French wanted to retaliate for Nasser's support of the French rebels, fighting for French independence. And for those of you in Italy, those French rebels apparently were also getting support from Enrico Mattei, the progenitor between the organizations you know today. It's a bit complicated, but yes. And today. And so you had the French trying to retaliate. You had the British wanting to retaliate. And you also had Israel that wanted to basically, deal with Nasser. Nasser was their perennial problem. I mean, the most pressing problem at that time. And again, so the Anglo-French-Israeli military campaign succeeded. They reached the Suez Canal. Okay? But what happened was, and you have to understand the complicated geopolitical picture around this time. You had the Soviet Union going into Hungary. You had Eisenhower worried about Egypt falling into now the Soviet camp as a result of this attack. And for that reason, the US basically told the Tripartite Alliance to basically give up what they gained in this war. And for that reason, Nasser basically declared victory by simply surviving. And from 1956 to 1967, this was the heyday of Nasser's popularity. And again, by simply surviving, you can declare victory. So many commentaries are saying this might be America's Suez crisis moment. Because 1956 was the final death knell of both British and French empires. If there was any indication that America's moment has arrived and the final twilight of Anglo-French imperial power, it survived World War II, but it didn't survive the Suez Canal crisis. Hence why so many people are saying it's not the Suez crisis that's going to might symbolize the end of American imperial power. Of course, it's the crisis of our home. It's an interesting historical analogy, but again, it might be too premature. I just wanted to refer to this, but again, you always see the problems of invoking historical analogies. Quite a lot of interesting similarities, but just to say, to ask yourself a question, does history indicate that this might be the twilight of American imperial power? Well, this is what we're going to wait and see. But let's not go to the flyer and say what is going to happen now as a result of this conflict. And I'm so grateful that you chose this map, the Middle East and the international system after the Iran war, because it's going to set up now the next
I'm
argument.
very proud of this slide.
I'm proud
You
of
have
this
to give it
slide.
to me, and very good at making slide.
Now, even though I'm Iraqi, I consider myself more Iraqi than Iranian. Nevertheless, I would say there's not something problematic about this map that's out there. And this is the most common way this map is situated out there, as well as the term the Middle East. And so if we're going to talk about a new international system, now we have to enter the debate. And who am I going to use to set up the debate for us? Well, the CIA. This isn't the CIA's map. And look what they prefer to call it, and look at the way they orient the map. It's Southwest Asia. A term that has now been gaining a lot more circulation. In fact, a book that coincided with the Iran war just came out by Mohammed Suleiman called West Asia. And what is his argument, you see? Both the Middle East, both as a term and the way the area is often situated in maps, give us a bias detrimental to understanding what this region should be called, the argument goes, Southwest Asia. And why the argument Southwest Asia? Well, simply put, let's compare the maps. Okay. Let's compare the maps. When you put Iraq at the center and Iran at the side, and this always happens when you look at the region, right? The cognitive bias begins almost immediately. Of course, when you put the Middle East in the middle like this, of course, it's a reminder the Middle East is a term that gained currency due to an American naval strategist. Let's not forget, we rarely do we call East Asia the Far East. But the US State Department for the longest time called its Middle East Bureau the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs. These are old colonial terms, but when it comes to the Middle East, right? Or the Near East for that matter, the term sticks. You even have one of the most prominent newspapers in the region is called Al-Sharq al-Awsat, the Middle East. But what does reorienting a map like this and calling it Southwest Asia do? In this case, you really do see Iran's centrality to three other Asias. And this is the whole point. When you give it the term Asia, you do see its centrality to three other Asians. Central Asia, South Asia, and then, of course, West Asia and South Asia. Then you see its centrality. And why is this, of course, important? Because when we talk about the international system, well, then let's look at the interacting parts, right? Because when you think a map like this, finally, we also remember, and often we forget that the so-called East Asia, what we call China, does border Afghanistan. It's often forgotten. It's often a small part. But when you look at a map like this, let's think about it. Pakistan, India, and China, and when you see a dashed border like this called the line of control, what are we reminded of? And let's not forget Pakistan is on the border with Iran, and there's a contested area here known as Baluchistan that straddles both borders, but we won't get there just yet. If we look at China, Pakistan, and India, and what these countries mean for the world order, besides contested borders, and let's not forget China and India almost went to war. You probably didn't pay attention to it because it was during COVID in 2020. And then not too long ago, a couple of days ago, India and Pakistan did engage in a five-day war. But what do three countries like this have? Disputed borders, they also have something else in common. What would that be? Well, politics students or anyone else. Both India, Pakistan, and China, besides having disputed borders, they share something else in common. A status, sorry? River. Besides the Punjab or the five rivers, something that if you're in Iran, you would probably be cognizant of. Nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons. We tend to forget this, yes. I mean, three states that are kind of in a quasi-state of war and ceasefires are also nuclear armed. Then you understand from Iran's perspective, it's not just about the Israeli nuclear arsenal that hasn't, even been officially declared, but if you look at it from this perspective, right, we tend to forget that. And then if you think about this, Afghanistan, This is not a problem that's gone away. It's a problem we are not paying attention to. Technically, Pakistan is in the state of war with Afghanistan. It's just there's only so much we can take into our bandwidth that they're fighting an active war with the Taliban, which is one of the greatest ironies of history. Because it's said without Pakistan, the Taliban would have never been able to take Kabul in 1996. Okay. But here we have a war with Pakistan and Afghanistan going on as we speak. Okay. And let's not forget what is also based in Afghanistan. And again, remember what I said, it was in this classroom in 2014 when I heard about the ISIS campaign in Iraq. There is a branch of ISIS in Afghanistan that in January 2024 conducted the largest act of domestic terrorism in Iran's recent history. That happened in January 2024. And then just 2 months later, what happened? One of the greatest domestic acts of terrorism in Russia's history, an attack on the Moscow theater, all claimed by the Islamic State branch in Afghanistan. And then one of the greatest crimes in not in Iran, not in Moscow, but in Vienna. Does anyone know what the Islamic State of Afghanistan claimed there? The Taylor Swift concert activated. Yeah. And that was his most dangerous target, the Swifties. The jihadis versus the Swifties. I mean, talk about a new international system. But that, from Iran's perspective, is there. Turkmenistan is fine. It's just a simple, quiet dictatorship with a dentist ruling on a lot of natural gas reserves. But let's not forget Azerbaijan and Armenia in a state of war since 2020. Okay. Its territory most likely used in this most recent Third Gulf War, because even though Azerbaijan is a 12 or Shia country, and you see how far sectarian identity goes in these conflicts, it is in an alliance with Israel. And most likely Azerbaijani territory was used to attack Iran in some way, whether it's intelligence gathering, so on and so forth. But quite interesting, Azerbaijan didn't get much Iranian retaliation compared to the United Arab Emirates. The ferocity that was unleashed, it was the UAE that bore the brunt of it. Azerbaijan, not so much. Very interesting, but the whole point is Armenia and Azerbaijan are in a state of war. And when you look at a map like this, we tend to forget Turkey is a member of NATO. Turkey is a member of NATO. We all saw how ballistic, no pun intended, Russia went with the possibility of Georgia and Ukraine joining NATO. So is it not a surprise that Iran is also wary of the fact that NATO is on its border? But also, what I say, maps make all the difference. Now you also understand the war in Ukraine through a different perspective when you look at a map like this. Because look at Georgia and look at Crimea. And when you look at the distance between this territory here, known as Abkhazia and Georgia today, and Crimea, you do understand Russia's geopolitical nightmare in a different perspective. Hypothetically, were Georgia and Ukraine to join NATO, Russia would have seen that as cutting off its access to the Black Sea. I mean, not just the Crimean Peninsula, but that shore. So think of where the Olympics were, right? And then finally, we work our way down. The longest border with Iran is a country that fought the longest conventional war in the 20th century. We tend to forget the Iran-Iraq War was the longest war of the 20th century, where weapons of mass destruction were deployed against Iran, and the world turned a blind eye. And of course, I'm talking about Iraq's use of chemical weapons. And then finally, we get to the Gulf. And now we've seen the international system in a way we never realized. Of course, we always paid attention to the hydrocarbons that pass through this region. But never did we think in terms of an international system, right? And I mean, we are in the city that is the headquarters for the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization. That it's quite ironic, we never associated this land with fertilizer and the production of byproducts that are used in fertilizer. You know, we tend to forget this is where, you know, agriculture probably developed in its earliest form. And we also forget that not too far from here are still the precursors in most of the world's fertilizers. And this is why I say, if you really want to understand the conflict and what it means for the international system afterwards, you have to look at the map like this. not like this. And realize that this is not just a war for the Middle East, but it is a war for three different Asias converging: West Asia, Central Asia, and South Asia. Okay. And now I have also one of the great experts on climate politics in the Mediterranean with us as well. I want you to think of the heat here in Berg today. And look at the temperature that was here not too long ago. 152 degrees Fahrenheit for the North Americans, 67.7 degrees Celsius. And why is this slide important? Why is this slide important? For this reason. In all the Gulf Wars, do you notice when they all took place? Usually in a short window from January to March. Because this is the thing, this is not too far from the island America was threatening to invade. Can you imagine the Americans with all their military gear fighting in temperatures like this? They were barely surviving in the January temperatures in Kuwait in 1991. And this was always my conclusion, just based on the weather, that the war had to wind up. Because not only can soldiers barely survive in this temperature, but also we tend to forget. The Apache helicopter that was recently shot down, that Apache was meant for Cold War Europe, fighting, in the Germany versus West Germany kind of terrain. Not sure what is in this hyperlink. One of the best things I can give you is this gift, and it's a gift for all of you. This interactive, look what the Germans do with their tax money. This wonderful interactive map on water stress and political tensions in Iran. Because this is what I'm going to conclude, but for any country, just look at this. This is beautiful, this conceptual model, this conflict history, hyperlinks. This is the best gift I could give you to your students, is something we're forgetting. Even the FAO being quoted here, okay? And just pick a part of the world. We tend to forget. Conflict in Libya and the Derna dam burst. Okay, this is your temperatures. This is your climate, the Medicane, that basically led to a dam in Libya not only getting destroyed, but the death of 10,000 overnight. And we barely, paid any attention to this climate. This is a harbinger of the future. Okay, I would argue. And again, when I was on the lecture circuit about the conflict in Iran, remember what I was speaking about was the shadow of the 12-Day War. It's hard to imagine. It's almost the 1-year anniversary of the 12-Day War, but it barely forms anything now in our imagination. But when I gave a lecture in November, what did I argue? That Iran invested in the wrong type of plants. Instead of nuclear plants, it was water processing plants, water desalinization plants that the Islamic Republic should have really been invested in. Okay. And then we finally get to now the international system and the hydrocarbons. And the ambassador talked about this, that Iran found a weapon greater than a nuclear program, basically weaponizing the flow of hydrocarbons. By hydrocarbons, I mean petroleum and its byproducts that we tend to forget, as well as natural gas. And here you see the interdependence of natural gas. When you look at Qatar's and Iran's natural gas field that is shared. This is something we also forgot. When I say forgot, the war plan.
This is the biggest in the world.
The biggest in the world. Ras Laffan, and not too far is the biggest oil field in the world. Right here, Al-Marashi in Saudi Arabia. And interestingly enough, yes, if you look at the Lloyd's list, interesting just anecdote. Lloyd's is one of the biggest insurers of ships in the world today. Does anyone know how it began? Lloyd's has a very similar story to Pete's or Starbucks. Lloyd's was a coffee shop in London. And basically it's where you went to get coffee, and who was getting coffee in London? The shippers, the people who were shipping stuff. And this is according to legend. How did you ensure prompt service at Lloyd's? To ensure prompt service, you left a coin. Tips. to ensure prompt service. That's where the word tips come from. It's not the plural of a tip. Tips was at Lloyd's the money you paid to get your coffee faster. And simply from a coffee house, it became one of the world's greatest insurers. And again, that's what I'm saying. Why is this so important? Is even the threat of violence is enough for Lloyd's to basically dictate the price of any goods shipped from this region. And finally, now to conclude, and this is for the media students, let's not forget we saw an interesting international weapon element of cognitive warfare in this most recent conflict for the media students now. Think of this. I mean, from the days of radio broadcasting as a weapon of war, the women in Germany and Tokyo who spoke perfect English as a way of demoralizing the American troops. Let's look how far we evolved. And so I'm going to show you two videos, and then we'll conclude and open up for questions. Okay. When was this Deutsche Welle video produced? The videos we all saw, when were they produced? Give me a guess for a date. Let's not forget, this is in response to the 12-day war last year. You see the possibility, the introduction of AI. The last person I was. They've used the weaponization of AI. We tend to forget it's almost a year old in this conflict. And see what a difference a year makes. Let's look at the evolution. You saw poorly produced videos of Tel Aviv in ruins. And ask yourself, what is more, as a weaponized war, in terms of the weaponization of AI, what is more effective? The videos of Tel Aviv in ruins that were shared millions of times are the following. Again, produced by the Iranian side in this conflict. Now, remember what I said. Saddam's Nasser declared victory. I won the war by surviving in 1956. And he used the Voice of the Arab radio station to declare victory. Saddam declared victory on Iraqi state TV. Most people didn't even know Saddam was declaring victory, but taking a rifle in front of a crowd and shooting it triumphantly. See how the Iranian side can declare victory after this most recent conflict. Okay, Now, when I show that to you and I see particularly my Gen Z kids laughing at that, what am I thinking? There was a famous book that came out of the 1991 Gulf War, the first Gulf War, saying the Gulf War did not take place. And the whole argument, the author would be the later inspiration. Sorry,
French journalist.
French. I think he was just a French philosopher. He was a journalist. Baudrillard.
Baudrillard.
Yes, Simulation and Simulacra, who gave birth to the Matrix franchise. Basically, when he said the Gulf War did not take place, what was he arguing? That for many of us watching this conflict on this new medium, cable news network, CNN, okay, basically meant that we were from such a distance to the war. How could we actually tell that there was a physical war taking place? We watched it from the comfort of our living rooms. 2003, that was the web blog had just been invented, otherwise known as the blog. I mean, look at the third Gulf War. If you want to take his, Baudrillard's idea of hyper reality, simulacra and simulation, I mean, look how far the ability of the Iranian narrative to not only kind of go over the head of the US in the sense that you see sovereignty, and this is YouTube delivering the Iranian narrative to you. Okay. I mean, if you look at these kind of phrases, right? I mean, let's look how, in terms of the ability of one state to appeal to the masses of its combatant, how far we've come in terms of communication warfare and artificial intelligence. All right. Now, uh, it's when we look at videos like this, I rethink about this book, The Geopolitics of Emotion, and its salience. Of course, it was written back in 2016, but it might be worth a reread, particularly amongst your generation. All right, so as I conclude, for a good number of my students, this is our final lecture together. For my media students, history students, IR students, but for the world politics students as well. Let's just put everything together in a final video by an astrophysicist named Carl Sagan. I want you to look at this because in the scheme of all that we've just watched, he gives us a bigger picture. And again, some of the imagery he gives in terms of a climate crisis. When he wrote these words, it was the early 90s when he wrote The Pale Blue Dot. But let's have Carl Sagan give a final just reflection on all these conflicts, whether it's the Vietnam War, the Third Gulf War. Because really his message is for your generation, particularly for those of you in your first years taking an introductory world politics class, but also for my kids who are graduating, or for my kids who are graduating graduate school. His lesson resonates with all of you. Sorry. Civilization. That's Vietnam. That's not modes. That's the UI. And that's, let's have him have the last word. I'll end on that point. Thank you for joining me. And I leave the floor to questions. Thank you. Questions.
I have one.
Please.
So, I have one little observation and then a request, something that I would like to discuss with you and students and everyone. So that little observation is that you mentioned how seizing territory around would be like Normandy. That would be way more difficult, way more difficult. Normandy is flat actually, and if you land in Normandy, you have the way to Paris is open. The only obstacle that you find, only geographical obstacle you find on the way to Germany is the Rhine River. Iran would be way more difficult, and the Americans spent months building up their something that just this is just a little tip. Reaching Tehran would be it's a nice this is the thing when I saw the build up the war last year the so-called 12-day war and we heard we're gonna change the regime it never happened first it never happened that you change the regime by bomb it's
From the air.
never happened you never won a war so from the air this has never happened so it was obvious, this was the question that I think any competent military advisor would have told anyone who was interested in that. Are you ready to invade the country? Are you aware of how difficult it is? This is the thing that blows my mind because Iran is four times bigger than Iraq in terms of the territory, twice the population. And it's mountains. Iraq doesn't have it has mountain ranges in the north, but
that's really but it's easy flat desert. Yeah, two roads.
Okay, no, you can build up your forces in Kuwait, in Saudi Arabia, for example. The first Gulf War was a massive build up the last months in Saudi Arabia. So it was really a totally different story.
We tend to speak of global weirding in terms of the weather, in terms of how we miss the real challenge is, what's happening in terms of our weather patterns. I couldn't have timed that perfectly. And we tend to forget D-Day was, yes, it was not only a coalition. By the way, when Eisenhower signed the order on June 5th, before the Normandy invasions. You know what he signed it off as? Not the commander of the Allies. The Allies is the nickname. The Normandy invasions, the United Nations. You can't forget it was done in the name of the United Nations. This was kind of what was supposed to be the original vision of the UN, was, a group of partners using military force to discipline a new, the belligerents like Germany, Japan. That was supposed to be the future vision. Wow.
Wow.
Well, yeah, exactly.
So, and by the way, you also signed, you also prepared the message in case the invasion failed.
Right. That's
But
right.
that's, another question I have for you is this, another thing that we may debate is, for example, whether this is the third or the fourth war, because in a certain sense, there was the conflict between Iran and Iraq also at a certain point started to revolve around the Persian Gulf, the tanker, which is called tanker war. So at a certain point, Iran and Iraq also started to. This was a very, very brutal conflict, which also involved the hitting cities, for example, and then also rats in ships in the Gulf. So it's debatable. But there is this thing. Sorry, just the question. Basically, all these conflicts they revolve around one thing, which is the fact that from the late 1970s, from the 80s, basically from the Carter Doctrine, January of 1980, the United States became somewhat the the hegemony in the Gulf. Basically, started to use its power to somewhat provide some form of favorable geopolitical configuration in the Persian Gulf region. So basically, Carter said that this region is so important that we will treat any kind of threat to change the status quo, the geopolitics of the Gulf as a vital threat that we will respond with military force too. In a certain sense, the Gulf War of 1991 was some sort of a test. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, puts his hands over Kuwait's oil, threatened Saudi Arabia and the United States. We're now acting on the Carter Doctrine, basically. So there was this. But in the last war, the United States did the opposite, actually. Instead of protecting its Gulf allies, it went over their heads. And then it proved incapable, actually. This is one of the problems. Iran retaliated against all the Gulf states, and the United States proved incapable of, adequately protecting them. So they, the Iranian drones, Iranian missiles, they would go through the defenses. Many of them were shut down with, at a very, very high cost, an immense cost. This thing. You have a $35,000 drone that is shot down with a missile that in some cases can cost up to $4 million.
Yeah,
so this proved to be basically all this configuration now is it doesn't work anymore. This is the thing. Is the Carter Doctrine over? All these countries that have invested, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, they invested tremendously in buying American weapons, hosting American bases, making President Trump happy in any possible. Qatar gave President Trump an airfare that is costing millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to. But they did everything possible to somewhat, in general, have a good relationship with the United States and in particular with Donald Trump to make sure that they had the sympathy of Donald Trump. How is this conflict changing the situation?
Okay, so just for everyone here, the original plan was to focus on the Carter Doctrine decades later. So let's remind ourselves. When Carter was president, remember the borders of the USSR reached here and reached here. Okay, you're not too far away from the Gulf. When Carter was president, remember Gulf oil for a time had been embargoed on the US. The price of oil quadrupled. So when we're talking about a Carter Doctrine, we're talking about basically the US articulating a vision where this becomes a national strategic asset for the US. when you speak of a corridor doctrine. If this were to be threatened, the US had to be ready to intervene. If not from a Soviet threat to these sources or to a future embargo. If oil were to be embargoed, the US was to intervene. And then let's not forget, when I say the borders of the Soviet Union were here and here, let's not also forget, by 1980, the borders of the Soviet Union are also here with the Soviet invasion only. So you see, when you have a Carter doctrine, right? This is a doctrine to more or less say, this is a geostrategic resource that is of paramount interest to the US. And here we develop a policy to protect us. One of those policies that began under Nixon was that both Saudi Arabia and Iran would be dual pillars of projecting American power in the Gulf. And then, of course, what happened with Nixon's plan? Of course, Iran became undone. You're just left with Saudi Arabia. So here we are now in 2026. I just kind of explained the geopolitical situation of the Carter Doctrine. What has become of it? And what can we speak of a future American doctrine to the Gulf? And I mean, I asked two questions without any answers. Since 2016, we've been trying to give a name to a Trump doctrine. To no avail. The Carter doctrine was pretty straightforward. The Eisenhower doctrine was pretty straightforward. If Lebanon was going to fall, its government was going to fall, you send in the Marines to prop up the incumbent Lebanese government for the fear that they were close to the communists. If Mossadegh takes over in 1953 in Iran, you launch a coup to overthrow him. So, I mean, I would ask you, what is your assessment? This is your assessment.
Also, the Reagan Collery.
Yeah, you're our expert on Reagan and Carter.
Is probably very important as well with regards to the alliance relationship and assurance of security towards the Saudi monarchy. Because first we have the Carter Doctrine, which was essentially after the Islamic Revolution in Iran, Strait of Hormuz, major area of interest for the United States, any foreign force, aka Soviet Union, we will send our troops in. After the election, Reagan extends this orally and makes it security assurance for the Saudi monarchy in Saudi Arabia. And so both of these doctrines are being questioned due to the fallout of the war and the uneasiness of many of these Arab Gulf states to continue to depend entirely on US security and US military umbrella. I would not say that these relationships, which have been built over decades, 70s and 80s being important periods, they're not going to die or end overnight. That will be a long time process. But definitely, I think that the confidence in the US's assurances has been shaken. We are seeing the emergence of interesting regional alliances. Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt are in dialogue for a serious military alliance. We already have a signed military alliance between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, which is one of the reasons why Pakistan has been negotiating so much. So there is a lot of movement, but I think that the US will remain the most influential actor in the globe for the rest of the time.
But you do mention something, an important dynamic that I didn't address. And again, for why I'm saying a map like this is so important, the role Pakistan played in mediating this conflict is again something quite interesting in the region. For a region that calls itself the Middle East, Pakistan is always cut off. But as both a neighbor and a country that's trying to kind of re-ingratiate itself with the US, Pakistan's role, as well as Qatar, doesn't get much attention, and Turkey to Egypt to some extent, were really significant for bringing this conflict to this side. That's something else that really needs to be addressed and really kind of highlights my point of Southwest Asia at place. Antonio?
So, quick anecdote and then question. So, in the early 2000s, when the second Gulf War was launched, I was involved with some artists, and there was a very popular toy camera that used a video cassette to record. It's called like a pixelator or something. Pixel vision. And they were really hard to find. A lot of avant-garde filmmakers loved them because they had this very sort of abstract feel to them. And we were trying to get some copies ourselves, and we were doing some research. And supposedly, I don't know if it's true or not, but the whole supply of those cameras was bought out by the US Navy at the time of the first Gulf War. And that's why you couldn't get them anymore, because they were like, apparently the US military had a use for them. They look surprisingly similar to the kind of videos we see of the missile striking in Iraq. Like those highly pixelated.
Yeah.
So when Baudrillard is writing, like war didn't exist, I mean, quite literally, it could be these toy camera images that were produced in the studio, that. But similarly to the President War, apparently Trump had like a real show to every day of like things getting bombed and destroyed, and that was his proof of it, or his
Proof of success
that that he won the war.
Interesting.
But anyways, that aside, the question is. I remember reading a long time ago an article about the Suez Canal, arguing that the reason why the U.S. basically was able to supersede the British Empire at that point was because the U.S. was the largest holder of British bonds, and basically threatened to liquidate all their bonds if they didn't pull out. And so, in a similar way, I think China is the biggest holder of American bonds, and they've Saudi Arabia as well. So I wonder if, from the background, I mean. Maybe it's different motivations, just the global economy, et cetera, motivating Trump to end this thing. But in the background, there could be some pretty serious threats about liquidating American bonds as a basic threat to just destroy our economy. And I don't know if that's a parallel there as well.
Well, I mean, there's another interest, I mean, along these lines. I mean, it goes back to Nixon, the withdrawal of gold from the US by Britain and France, and abandoning the gold standard and the birth of the petrodollar around the same time. So there was also just another, I mean, this brings in another interesting debate, it keeps on coming up, were the actions in both Venezuela and Iran due to alleged threats by both states to abandon the US petrodollar at the same time. Again, these are just the interesting parameters of this debate. That anyone feel free to chime in on this, but here we are in 2026, living through the repercussions of these events in the 70s, the rise of the petrodollar, abandoning the gold standard, brings in Venezuela as well into this.
Also, I would say that the biggest kind of macro theme that we are talking about, but perhaps in the elephant in the room, is the rise of China, and therefore the United States is no longer by far the superpower that can do as it pleases, and therefore there is pushback on a whole number of issues. And this war is probably one of the first serious wars where this multipolarity of the system is coming out. But I really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
If I may. Also, especially on the historical parallels, and of course, as historians, it never repeats, but there is rhyme throughout history. Maybe if I could add just a tiny point with regards to the plagiarism, given that you were directly involved in this by the British government, who plagiarized your work. Also, in the case in the run-up for the war in 2026 with Iran, the U.S. State Department, or the White House, actually plagiarized the entire report of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy.
Didn't know this, fascinating.
If you go to the website,
okay,
the White House website, the official document that makes the case for the war, I think it's 5 pages long, 3 of which are word by word from a report of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, which is a private think tank. With,
but I think they would be happy for that. I mean, this is what they're there for.
They have been advocating a war in Iran for many years, for decades.
Yes. I didn't know.
So that's interesting.
That's very
crying for you. But on climate change, I think it's very important to consider that this is completely, since I would say the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been completely taken off from the agenda. This is very, very serious. I mean, the bombings that we are seeing in Russia, in Ukraine, in Iran, targeting energy infrastructure, these are creating emissions which are incredible. We're talking about rain and acid rain, oil rain. This will have also repercussions on those who live there now. So it's not something in the future. We are already really seeing it here. With regards to this, I think also there's a lot of new research done on how the Paris climate change of 2015, the report completely excludes all military emissions. And if you go and look, the Pentagon itself every year does more emissions than 5 or 6 major European countries combined. So these are debates that should be also had, I think, and something that should bring us all together to try and focus on. So.
We tend to forget there was this episode that kind of got obscured in March 2023. I mean, what was a regional Cold War between Iran and Saudi Arabia came to an end without much fanfare, but in Washington, D.C., it was a monumental moment. Iran and Saudi Arabia's regional Cold War came to an end with Chinese intervention. Those events were later eclipsed a couple of months later with the events of October 7th, 2023. But I mean, absolutely. I think that was an announcement of China's arrival, but a different type of arrival. And always the question is, if Suez represented the ascendancy of the US at the expense of Anglo-French Empire, perhaps this is now the great question. If with the waning of American empire, China, by not doing anything, a very Sun Tzu moment, is this now China's last decade? With climate, it's, the NATO, you mentioned Ukraine. I think Ukraine was the defining moment. The NATO strategic document mentioned before the invasion of Ukraine, climate change was never mentioned by NATO. Then you have a new strategic document where it's mentioned 13 times. Okay, so finally NATO is paying attention to this. And then, of course, the events in Ukraine happen. And so for any momentum, I mean, when we talk about NATO addressing climate change, this is, remember the US is a partner. This is one of the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases that there are. It's absolutely, these recent conflicts have led this issue to be forgotten, unfortunately. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, NATO's approach on climate change is very much looking at the links or nexus, which is all to be proven between climate change and violent conflict.
Yes.
Civil wars or intra-state wars. Not as being proven yet, as well as the migration link, which is also very interesting for me. Especially the southern part.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about it, I mean, even to this day, the idea of a climate refugee is still being debated by the people in the field. I mean, so this is where we are in the field as it is. Yeah, it's still something that is a matter. We're still debating are these viable concepts. Yes.
One curiosity about the proxies, I believe you call them, of Iran. They were very active in Syria process, but they have still support or have support in Lebanon, that we're talking about. They are allied with Yemen, but it's not on government.
That is a big fault of the math, yeah.
And the direct question, how's the influence of Iran in Iran?
It's complicated. Yeah, it's so complicated, this answer, with Iraq in this case. And I'll tell you, as a family that comes from a Shia family that straddles both sides of the borders, even the most, let's say, Shia of Shia, whether it's a militia or clerical family, is always resistant to Iranian control. They believe it should be the other way around. We are the place of Najaf and Karbala. We are the sites of the two Shia shrines. It's where Imam Ali is buried in Iraq, not Iran. So always, no matter how close the alliance is, it's always one of agency. So that even the most pro-Iranian Iraqi militias will always say, at the end of the day, we are the true Shias in this relationship. That's the easy answer. Just speaking from the Shias. Of course, the other populations, it gets much more complicated. The Kurds have had a complicated history with Iran. The Sunnis, of course, basically say we lost our country to the state we fought for 8 years. And these are very much blanket statements. But at the end of the day, when Iran was in the position of patronage, even Arab Sunni politicians would take money from Iran, even Kurdish politicians would take. So that's what I say it's complicated, because on one level it involves identity, On the other, it involves simply money. And the Iranians were very generous in terms of the patronage networks that went beyond the Shia. Even with Hezbollah, it's complicated. I'll just give you a quick anecdote. It's believed that the supreme leader of Iran told Hezbollah, do not attack Israel after October 7th, but that Hezbollah disobeyed him. And that's why you saw when Hezbollah's leader was assassinated, Iran didn't come immediately to Lebanon's aid. It's quite interesting. Now they are. And I'm wondering if it's a lot more than just fighting on behalf of Hezbollah or making a fuss beyond Hezbollah. But the inter-Shia conflict is really something that gets ignored. But it's definitely there. And a lot of it, it's very hard to prove because you give this united axis of resistance front perception. But then you have the realities, the Hezbollah Khamenei tension that, Hezbollah went above the head of the supreme leader of Iran. How could you do that? But it would make sense if you saw what unfolded afterwards. Hezbollah took a huge beating. Iran stood aside while that happened. But then again, you have this very surprising, nonsensical thing. Hezbollah retaliating after Khamenei was killed and inviting an Israeli invasion. And this didn't make sense in the beginning, but now in hindsight, well, you do realize Hezbollah this time around fought Israel to a standstill. And that does say something. Hezbollah was, written off as a regional force, and again, it hasn't gotten much attention, but we thought Hezbollah was depleted and defeated, but it did fight the Israelis to a certain amount and put up a tenacious resistance, because maybe it's what they wanted all along. Again, a lot of questions with no answers. Why did the Houthis stay out of it? The Yemenis again. Again, another interesting question. Because again, if you had both straits, more or less out of commission, and for those of you who probably don't realize, all the Robusta coffees you get in the morning, which are really big in Italy, most of it is coming by Vietnam, and it's coming through here. You don't realize most of your coffee is coming from Vietnam. Lavazza, for all its claims of the good stuff comes maybe from Central America, the Arabica, but the cheap stuff that gives you a good high is coming from Vietnam. And that's just because the US dropped so much Agent Orange on Vietnam. The only thing that will grow on that soil right now is the Robusta coffee, which is the cheaper version that has a much more of a caffeine hit. It's the one I like. I don't like the Arabica. It's too, it's not strong enough for me. But it's coming through streets, the Bab el-Mandeb, ironically passing through a city called Makka on the Yemeni coast, where the world's coffee used to come from. Makka, think of the mocha you use on the oven. That's mocha. Mocha is referring to the town of Makka in Yemen, where all the world's coffee used to come from. Geopolitics of coffee. There you go.
One thing that you can say about that, particularly the Houthis in Yemen, etc. One thing that Iran did very well in this war, again, I would say it's with sympathy, but it's they managed the escalation in a way that was masterclass in managing escalation. So they replied, every blow that they took, they had a counterpunch. Yes, this was so. You may argue that there is much more than Iran can do. Can block the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb.
Yeah, exactly.
Pro-Iranian militias in Iraq, they have a network of, that they can go after. If only, one episode that happened, but likely didn't follow through was, for example, desalinization plants were bombed, were hit. And you take out water there, people, how long can you survive in the desert without water?
The target
is
desalinization.
You mentioned Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and these countries, you don't have, it rains in Iran. It doesn't rain very much in Saudi Arabia or in other parts of the Arab Peninsula. So that could be, there's so much more damage that could be done that is really, this war was.
We tend to forget about the weaponization of water. The Houthis actually experimented with it. They were the first. They used to fly drones over the Saudi desalinization plants, not hitting them, but just telling Saudi Arabia we can hit them if we want. And vice versa, Saudi Arabia did attack Yemeni water supply during its bombing campaign. So we tend to forget how water has been weaponized. And then let's not forget that other way water is being used now is for the AI data centers, which were also targeted during this war. So, I mean, quite an interesting dynamic, whether you're weaponizing water directly or the centers that just take up so much of the water supply of the region.
You didn't say much about Israel, but I'm wondering, is ever the thought that Israel might use a nuclear weapon against Iran part of a scenario that these war games?
Good point. I mentioned Israel. I mean, you see how much time it just took to deal with the US and Iran. You know, our entire class, and I couldn't even bring Israel into this. Just briefly, I mentioned this nuclear program. You know, Israel always, its doctrine was if Israel were to ever go under, so to speak, the nuclear weapons would be used. I mean, in 1973, it was always said that if Egypt went beyond Sinai or Syria went beyond Golan into Israel proper, nuclear weapons would be used. Israel always said, you know, we have any weapon that can reach any Arab capital, but always the assumption is, and remember, Israel operates under a policy of nuclear opacity. They want you to guess how many weapons it has. They want you to guess its nuclear doctrine. But always was, we would never introduce them unless we were attacked. That had been this. But now, I mean, it's a different Israel we're also talking about. It's an Israel under Netanyahu. It's an Israel where people like Ben Gvir are, you know, developing, you know, policies. So we also have to bring all of this into question. I mean, it's hard to even imagine. I mean, let's say hypothetically, were Iran to ever cross that threshold, test the bomb, would you know, a nuclear weapon ever be used against, you know, all this enriched uranium underneath the soil? Again, I asked just for the, you know, I put up my hands in the air and say it's a question mark. I mean, this was, I mean, and when we get to that issue, I mean, I think this is the point. Israel operates under a strategy of nuclear opacity. Yeah, it always has. So very good question, yeah, which I don't really have the answer. All I have is this the historical precedent. When the closest it would have ever come was probably in 73, when it seemed like Syria had the possibility of crossing in from the Golan into Israel. Yeah.
Any questions from students? Don't be shy, guys. You don't know.
Just very quickly, is there an American presence in Pakistan? So I can see them kind of helping the Pakistanis and their war.
American presence? No, not formally. Remember, this is getting the complicated. There's a complicated history here. American presence. I remember when the Soviets invaded, there was definitely a CIA presence in Peshawar. Remember the American contractors during the war on terror that were involved in killing some Pakistanis. If there was an American presence, they certainly didn't know that bin Laden was in Abbottabad. So in other words, well, how do you define an American presence? But not that kind of military presence.
I mean, like CIA or.
I mean, absolutely, without a doubt, there's going to be American CIA there. I mean, from Peshawar, you don't give up those networks from those days. But again, it's just like you and me and what I was telling Antonio. It's a matter of we can only make conjectures about this.
Like, there's no official American.
No, I mean, there have been contractors. There's obviously a lot of the military attaches in Karachi and Islamabad are probably. I mean, it goes without saying these are CIA assets. I mean, this has been an old American strategy. Yeah, definitely.
But there was a very, very close relationship between, Pakistan is this strange country. It's one of the peoples. It's crucial for China. It's crucial for the United States. So, for example, U-2 planes during the Cold War, planes that could, fly over the Soviet Union and take pictures of, intelligence. Sometimes they took off or landed in Pakistan.
Oh, you didn't know this fascinating. I had no idea.
And Norway, this flight, very long flights to Norway to before satellites. During the Cold War, there was this thing. during, for example, during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Pakistan became a crucial ally of the United States. So because indeed it's been politically very close until it's very strange because Pakistan also is pivotal for China. If China, there is one of the big projects in the Belt and Road initiative was building a port. Because if you build, Pakistan shares a border with China. So if you build a port in, you don't have to go through, for example, what is called the East China Sea.
Right here.
It can be a trade route. You can access the Indian Ocean.
This is Iran's port, and your Pakistan's right here, both in the Baluchistan area. Yeah. And it was always said that Iran would try to get India to invest in here as a way.
And Pakistan was also crucial for the US invasion of Afghanistan, for example. If you look at Afghanistan, it's landlocked. So how do you bring your supplies? How you could supply your forces?
Iraq is also very helpful for the US invasion of Afghanistan.
We tend to forget in 2000, let's go back to some interesting historical precedents. In 2001, if any US pilot got shot down in Afghanistan and landed in Iranian territory, the Iranians said, well, we won't harm them, we'll give them back to you. And you also have to remember there's nothing inevitable about this war. In 2003, right after the Iraq War, Iran did approach the US and say, let's make a grand bargain. It's the same guy, Ayatollah Khamenei, said, the nuclear issue, our missiles, our proxies. We tend to forget the US refused the Iranian overture back in 2003. Coming out of the Iraq War, the US thought it was unstoppable, that Syria and Iran would fall next. Remember, this is the age of Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz and Cheney. So we tend to forget the situation that we find ourselves in now. There's nothing inevitable about these dynamics. There's always missed opportunities that could have avoided.
It's actually this kind of paradox when you think about the US and Iran. They are natural allies. Anyone that the United States doesn't like or creates trouble for the United States, it also creates trouble for Iran. Okay, Saddam Hussein, was first the nemesis of Iran, and then it became the nemesis. So the U.S. and Iran both didn't like Saddam Hussein. The Taliban, for example, this is a radical Sunni group, and Iran didn't like the Taliban.
Iran, the Taliban were about to go to war in 2001. We forgot how close those two were about to fight.
It's strange. There are two countries that actually should be friends, not enemies.
Exactly. Very good. Well,
any other question?
If you have questions, I think my email is there's one of my emails, my Instagram account as well. Get in touch. But thank you, all of you, for coming, both faculty and students.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for another big round. Okay, you are my students, you remember. If you have been taking notes, you can get the extra credit. Okay.
That really worked. I was also yeah.
No, I'm saying after number one. I'm coming back.
It's the best time of year. I'll be back. Yeah. Yeah. It's they don't go as fighting. People are doing something that are trying to record that the US can't do, I see. And I find that interesting and fascinating.